Yeah, that's great. No problem. I'm super happy to be here. I'm super excited that you're all here and to get to learn from you. My goal here is to basically share with you a lot of the science, a lot of the science that we as a scientific community have conducted, and what we've learned over the last several decades, or what we've learned over the last decade from the extensive fire history. All the fire that's occurred in both the Selway Bitterroot and the Frank Church wilderness. Real first, though, I work for this organization called the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Not everyone knows this. It actually is Forest Service, so we're all Forest Service employees. We're part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, kind of Forest Service research and development. I'm the fire guy, but we also have other scientists doing social science. We've got a wildlife scientist as well, and an aquatic ecologist as a scientist as well. So we try to do. We're very broad, but we've got we've got some good people working on some great scientific topics in wilderness. So the Selway Bitterroot and the Frank Church, they're freaking awesome, right? The biggest Forest Service wilderness areas in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So we have the great honor of working in these areas and stewarding these areas, and because they're so large and remote, there's a lot of fire that occurs within them and allows us to conduct some pretty cool studies. So just a reminder of the Wilderness Act, right? The Wilderness Act is, wilderness is intended to protect and preserve natural conditions, and wilderness is primarily free from modern human manipulation and impact. So that would, of course, mean, fire suppression. However, wilderness designation does not prevent managers from suppressing fires when conditions warrant, and that's often the case. So what I think is great about the Frank Church and the Selway Bitterroot is that the last point there, the suppressing fires, is not like the number one option. It's not always the go-to. You all have been allowing fires to burn in these wilderness areas for a long time, which is great. It's in tune with the Wilderness Act, but it's also great because fire is an ecological process, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But then it allows us to do these cool studies. So it's awesome. So thank you. Anyway, remember, fire is an ecological process. These photos in this fire-scarred sample are from the Lick Creek demonstration site, which is not so far from here and not so far from the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. But in lots of these forests, fires occurred, especially these lower elevation dry forests. These fires occurred every 10 to 15 years or something like that. And then in the late 1880s or the late 1800s, fire got turned off. We started excluding fire from these ecosystems. And this particular example on the left, if you do the math, 9 fires have been missed between 1889 and 2001. So if 9 fires are missed, you can imagine what happens to our ecosystems in this case, or our forests. And this is a lower elevation site. As we move upslope, fire was less frequent over time and less fires may have been missed, but probably most of the wilderness, both the wilderness areas, are affected by this fire exclusion. So here's an example. I went through and tried to find fire scar samples from both wilderness areas, and here's what I found from the Frank Church wilderness area. The dots on the right show fire-scarred samples from 2 sites, low elevation, warm sites in the Frank Church wilderness, right? And you could see that there was a lot of fire, especially at the Colson Creek site. There was a lot of fire up until about 1900, and then it started slowing down. And then in 1935, fire got turned off, right? And so this study basically said, yes, that the forests have changed a lot because of that fire exclusion. Next slide. In the Selway Bitterroot, when we're looking at the highest elevations, fire is definitely less frequent, right? The inverted triangles show fire events in these different watersheds in these subalpine forests in the Selway Bitterroot. And so, fire was less frequent. Nothing had burned really between 1934 and the year 2000. Next slide. But 3 of those 4 sites have burned since the year 2000. So I checked it out. Oh, can you go back one? So, whether or not there's fire exclusion has affected these highest elevation areas, we don't really know, but probably not that much. But everything that below there and down to the ponderosa pine forest has certainly been affected to some degree by fire exclusion and changes in forest composition and density. But let's talk about the wilderness areas, right? Some more. There's this great general technical report that came out a year or two ago by Julia Berkey and Andrew Larson and Carol Miller, talking about how basically we've moved from fire control, from putting out all the fires, to more fire management and letting more fires burn. So it's definitely recommended reading. And there's these cool maps in there that kind of show, or do show, not kind of show, the amount of fire that's occurred over different time periods in these wilderness areas. And you can see that on the very right, that's the kind of the fire management after we went from fire control to fire management, allowing more fires to burn in the wilderness. And it also talks about kind of how it all started. It all started in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, where these old timers, when they were not so old, like over 50 years ago, came up with this crazy idea to not put out fires. And they came up with this in the White Top drainage of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, a plan to say, hey, let's not put out these fires. And there's a reunion in 2017, a 45-year reunion, which this photo is from. And so the plan was signed by the chief of the Forest Service in 1972. And on that same day, there was a lightning strike, and this snag started burning in the White Cap drainage. It didn't go anywhere. It's just a burning snag. But it was like the first time, really, the Forest Service is like, all right, let's just stand back. So it was a paradigm shift. So even though that particular fire didn't go anywhere, it was just the idea. It was the beginning of it all, right? And then in 1973, it was kind of more of a real test. The Fitz Creek fire burned 1,200 acres in the White Cap drainage. And then, after that point, fire management plans were extended to the entire wilderness, and more fires were allowed to burn. Frank Church is really interesting because they had a kind of a non-suppression fire management plan developed in 1979, which is before the Frank Church Wilderness was even established, which was in 1980. So I think that's pretty cool. And then in 1984, in the Frank Church, they had a fire management plan that extended the entire wilderness that allowed for lightning ignitions to burn. And this is the result, right? There's been a lot of fire in both the Frank and the Selway Bitterroot. Most of the Frank has burned at least once since 1972. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I do want to just point out that this fire is allowing us to do a lot of cool projects. And I want to, thank everybody in this room for, managing the wilderness, managing the fire, and also being really great collaborators and helping us do studies in the wilderness. We've got Andrew has a graduate student in the wilderness right now, in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness right now, and folks in this room helped coordinate and help facilitate that field work and this research. So thank you, and keep up. Let's keep up our work together. It's awesome. This example of all the fire or all the studies that have occurred in these wilderness, a review paper that Andrew talked about moments ago was just published a week or two ago by Mark Kreider. He's sitting back there. He's talking a little later, but not about this. And it shows the amount of studies that have occurred in these wilderness areas, and it highlights what we've learned in wilderness areas over the years because of these extensive fire histories. And if you look closely, you'll see the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness is at the top of the list. There's been more fire science studies occurring in that wilderness than any other wilderness. The next on the list is the Frank. So super awesome. So again, thank you. But to get back, this review highlighted what was learned from these wilderness fire studies, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But as Andrew mentioned, there's also some stuff that wasn't learned, or what we thought was missing from the wilderness fire science literature. These are some of the topics, and again, there's white post-its, big post-its around the room for you all to kind of help us fill out this list and help us know what your research needs are. So in future years, and when we are thinking about projects, we can kind of think about what the wilderness fire science needs are. There's also a couple in that room over there that are kind of hidden. So there'll be more about this later at the breaks. But let's talk about what we've learned from this extensive fire history that's occurred in the wilderness areas. Well, one of the things we've learned is that when there's a burned area, there's less likely to be ignition within that burned area for at least 15 years in the Frank Church in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. And we used fire history maps that have occurred, in both these wilderness areas to learn this. So we've also learned that that fires also serve as basically like a fire break or a fuel break. And if a fire occurs and then another fire occurs somewhat later and burns into this previously burned area, that previously burned area will act as a fire break or fuel break for about 15 to 20 years in the Selway Bitterroot in the Frank Church Wilderness. When you think about them both together, one of these studies is looking at the ability of, are fires likely to ignite within these previous burns or not? And the other study is looking at, do the previous burns act as a fuel break if fires are moving towards them? But another thought we had is like, okay, what about the overall probability of fire? How less likely are areas to reburn overall? So we learned that, we asked that. And we did this, I'm going to get in a little more detail on this one. But again, using these awesome fire history maps, we basically asked what's the probability of reburning. If you look at the total probability of reburning in the Selway Bitterroot, in areas less likely to burn for over 20 years in the Selway Bitterroot, basically where those lines cross, the dashed line at the top is the kind of the treatment longevity, if you will. And in the Frank Church, say a little over 25 years, somewhere between 25 years and 30 years, areas are less likely to burn. The other thing we've looked at is that there's a lot of variability within these study areas, right? So we've looked at basically warm and dry sites in the Selway Bitterroot and versus colder and moist sites in the Selway Bitterroot. Also in the Frank, I'm just showing the Selway Bitterroot here. And you basically see that, the effectiveness of that past fire, its influence on the next fire is weaker and lasts shorter in the lower elevation dry sites, and at the higher elevation sites that the effect lasts longer. And we also looked at how drought years kind of affect this, right? And so in your warm and dry years, fires are more or less, they're more likely to reburn. It's not, it's kind of makes sense intuitively, right? Of course, but now we have numbers on it for both of these wilderness areas. So basically, in warm and dry years, in areas a past fire has less of a treatment effect, or the treatment effectiveness is shorter compared to your non-drought years. We've also been able to ask just what impedes fire spread? Why do fires stop? And where do they stop? And why? And so we asked, what's the effect of daily weather and topography and fuels on where fires stop? And in the Selway Bitterroot and in the Frank Church, fuel limitations tend to stop fire. Fuel limitations also include the effect of previous burns, but also include just non-productive areas, less vegetated areas like probably rocks and what have you. But also daily weather is the second most important factor. So the areas on the boundaries of these fires on average tend to have, say, colder daily temperatures than when they're burning on the interior of the fire. And last and least is topography. Still a significant factor in stopping fire spread. Fires tend to stop on ridge tops and valley bottoms. That's what it comes down to. Let's talk about resuming active fire regimes, which is an active area of research for Andrew and his graduate students. This is the only slide that's a non-Selway Bitterroot and non-Frank slide. So this is from the Bob Marshall Wilderness, but Andrew went in and looked at this area that had burned once in 2003 and then burned again in 2011. And after the 2003 fire, what happened is a bunch of little tiny lodgepole pines started coming up. And then the second fire in 2011 killed all those tiny lodgepole pines, but left the big ponderosa trees. So it's interesting, if that 2011 fire hadn't have occurred, we'd basically be left with a lodgepole pine forest with some big ponderosa pines sticking out of it, right? But now the resumed fire regime in this ponderosa pine woodland and savanna has basically restored it back to ponderosa pine when there was, these other tree species kind of popping up in the absence of fire. So Andrew concluded that basically some of these unlogged forests have, kind of this latent resilience to resuming fire, to resuming an active fire regime. Something else we've learned from Melissa Jaffe, a recent graduate student at University of Montana, was in the Selway Bitterroot in 2021. And she went to once burned sites and twice burned sites and 3 times burned sites in mesic mixed conifer forests. And basically, I'm just focusing on the tree regeneration part of her study, but there was tree regeneration across all the sites, right? Even at the 3 times burned. And almost all the sites were within 200 meters of a seed tree, a live seed-bearing tree. And what that means is we don't expect there to be like seed limitations, seed source limitations, because there's the patches are not super duper huge. The patches of high severity fire aren't super duper huge. So basically, these mixed conifer forests of the Selway Bitterroot wilderness and elsewhere currently remain resilient to wildfire. Melissa says currently because we don't know what's going to happen under a future climate, right? Well, also the caveat that this study was conducted in mesic mixed conifer as opposed to maybe some drier forest types. So we might see something different were Melissa to have sampled in drier forest types. Here's another cool study, fire and salmon. None of us here had anything to do with it, but it's just this really cool study that looked at how fires affected salmon habitat or salmon spawning habitat. And fire actually encouraged salmon habitat by, because of debris flows and whatnot, gravel was being input into the system, and the Chinook salmon use gravel to do their spawning. There's these, they have these nests, nests of sorts called redds, salmon redds, where they lay their eggs. What also is kind of cool about this is on the right, that's the middle fork of the Selway, no, not the Selway River, which river is that? Salmon River. First of all, it kind of looks like a heart to me. Right? It's got like the veins and stuff. But also it's the heart of the Frank Church Wilderness, So it's like literally and figuratively the heart. So we've had some great fun times in the wilderness. And, again, thanks to a lot of you in this room for helping us get out there and facilitating. But so thank you. And, that's it. We went a little shorter than time, but I think that's good but I do have some time for questions, I believe. So again, thanks to all of you, and keep up the good work.
Good time for 1 or 2 quick questions for Sean.
All right. We do have one. Hello. Yes.
So you mentioned earlier that according to the tree rings, I think you were suggesting that we know that late 1800s, early 1900s, it started being, there was less fires occurring on the landscape. We know there's a causation with fire suppression activities being the result of that, or is it just coincidence that there started to be suppression activities? I'm just thinking about, I've often wondered about, were those early activities actually that successful until after World War II? Do we know how many new starts there actually were versus the acres that burned?
Right. Well, I don't know if we know about number of starts versus acres burned, but we do know that, you're right, effective fire suppression, especially in the heart of the wilderness, probably didn't occur until, after the war. But we know that about in the late 1800s, we know that fire got turned off, and it's a result of fire suppression, even though it might not be very effective, it's easy to go out, especially in these dry forests, and put something out, right? But also the removal of people from the landscape, or the indigenous burning that occurred. Because people started a lot of fires, and this time period corresponds very strongly with when people were removed from the landscape. And this is also a research need you'll see around here about indigenous fire use in wilderness. But overall, in the greater fire science world, we are getting better at learning about the historical use of indigenous people's fire, and it's actually quite fascinating. And there was a lot of it, so I think the removal of that ignition source is a big deal. Another thing would be places that were intensively grazed. We removed the grazing removed the fine fuel, so there's no grass to carry the fires. And so a lot of places were grazed pretty hard, and even if there was a start and it wasn't suppressed, it couldn't go anywhere because there's no grass to carry the fire.
All right, perfect timing.